Okay, so let's take a moment and let's define our terms. Self-blended learning is in the title of this course, and it's a term you probably haven't heard that much before. Some resources refer to self-blended learning a little bit differently, so it'll be important that I kind of walk you through this. So I'm going to take two terms, I'm going to put them together. One is blended learning, and the other is self-directed learning. Let's start with blended learning. I really like the definition that Michael Horn has used, who's with the Clayton Christensen Institute, where he talks about blended learning being a formal education program where the student is learning partially online, partially face-to-face, and the student has some measure of control over time, pace, place, and the learning pathway. So there's this taking the best of online learning and the best of face-to-face learning and putting them together. And it's done within a formal learning organization according to that definition. It also has a piece there, though, where the learner is getting some increased control over time and pace, so how quickly they work and the amount of time they have to work on something potentially, as well as the pathway, the journey they take to get there. And that really leads us into a second set of definitions. I'll give you a couple of them, maybe two or three, for self-directed learning. Now, one definition, I'm going to read this one to make sure I get it right. It's from Gibbons in 2002. And he explains that self-directed learning is any increase in knowledge, skill, accomplishment, or personal development that an individual selects and brings about by his or her own efforts, using any method in any circumstances at any time. I know there's a lot there, and you don't have to unpackage all of that right now. But let me give you a second definition that has some parallels. This is from Malcolm Knowles, all the way back in 1975. He describes self-directed learning this way. Broadly, as a process in which individuals take the initiative with or without the help of other to diagnose their learning needs, formulate learning goals, identify resources for learning, select and implement learning strategies, and evaluate learning outcomes. So in both of these definitions, we find something that's key, and that's sort of common to them. The learner has more control and ownership for the learning, for what's learned, how it's learned, and when it's learned. With that in mind, let me explain this in kind of four questions that I think will help. And it fits with maybe a traditional teaching mindset, and we'll sort of contrast a teacher-centered and a student or learner-centered approach here. So one of the key questions that a teacher asks is, what do I want or need students to learn, right? They might write out their learning goals or learning objectives. When we become more self-directed, the question moves from the teacher to the student, and so now it's the student asking, what do I need or want to learn? A second question that a teacher might ask is, how will I know when the students have actually learned it? And that leads them to create some kind of assessment or test or assignment or something like that to document, to be able to determine whether or not the students have actually learned what they wanted or needed them to learn. From the more self-directed standpoint, the question goes to the student, and now the student asks, how will I know and show what I've learned? So how will I document it? How will I be able to demonstrate to myself and to others that I've met this goal and that I've learned it? So it's the learner's task to try to come up with that to some extent. A third question is, okay, so I know where I want to be, and I've come up with a way to measure whether or not I've gotten there. So the third question is, from the teacher, how will I help the students get there? How will I teach them or help them learn? From the self-directed standpoint, it's the learner who asks the question, and the learner says, well, how am I going to get there? How am I going to learn this? What do I need to do? What resources do I need? What strategies, what practices, what experiences? What do I have to do in order to reach this goal and show and know that I've learned this? And then a fourth question I'll throw in there that's part of this mix as well. Good teachers ask this. They ask the question, how am I going to make sure I know how students are doing along the way? Kind of monitor their progress, check their understanding, so that I can step in and help them if they're going astray, or if they're making progress, I can encourage them. Well, from the self-directed learning standpoint, this is the learner asking the question. The learner's saying, so how am I going to know how I'm doing? How will I check my own progress and my own understanding? So it's the same thing. The real shift here in self-directed learning is we're trying to empower and encourage the learner to own it, to own that learning. So that brings us to the name of this course, Adventures in Self-Blended Learning. What is self-blended learning? It's essentially blended learning plus self-directed learning. So take the two definitions, or the blended learning definition and the set of others that I gave you, mix them together in a soup, and we have self-blended learning soup, right? So self-blended learning is especially interested in ways that students are self-directing, but that's blending with more formal learning organizations and learning environments. It's where students might be in a course at a school, and they have a teacher, and it might be a very traditional experience. But the student is doing something in addition that's supplementing or enhancing or expanding their learning. And we're going to get into more of that in the future.